In 1974, Gerald Ford, the vice president of Richard Nixon, ascended to the presidency after Nixon resigned. Immediately after Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford basically pardoned him. What this meant is that Nixon would not come up for criminal charges such as obstruction of justice or perjury or lying before a criminal court outside of the impeachment trial. So this would be a separate trial. And this in 1974, he pardoned him, and Ford was quoted as saying, "Our long national nightmare is over." But unfortunately, this move sort of backfired because much of the public wanted to see Nixon punished, and this hurt Gerald Ford's popularity. The major issue during the Ford presidency was inflation. And so Gerald Ford came up with this pretty cool idea called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN. And basically the idea behind WIN was that voluntarily producers and consumers throughout the economy would try to reduce inflation by holding prices steady or not asking for such high wages. But unfortunately, this didn't work too well, and you saw a continuation of stagflation, which we talked about in the last lecture, which is basically low economic growth and rising prices. So here's a nice little win button that they had. And so in the election of 1976, despite this, the Democrats didn't win in a landslide, as you might think. They nominated Jimmy Carter from Georgia, and Carter was considered a Washington outsider. He didn't have many friends in Washington, and much of the country was annoyed with Washington. They thought that Washington was corrupt and whatnot after the whole Watergate scandal. So this was very appealing about Jimmy Carter. Additionally, what's important to note is that he was an evangelical Christian, or born-again Christian, and this helped him narrowly carry the southern states, which had become Republican strongholds. So in the end, Jimmy Carter does end up winning a pretty close election, with 50% of the popular vote versus 48%. And it's interesting to note, if you look at the selection map, that the trend of Republican strength in the West has already started to emerge. So now we get into the Carter presidency, and he too has to deal with stagflation. And the underlying causes behind stagflation are pretty much as follows. LBJ, going back to LBJ, tried to pay for Vietnam and his Great Society economic platform without raising taxes. So this helped cause inflation by pumping too much money into the economy. Additionally, there was the oil embargo by OPEC, and while the embargo ended within a few weeks and within a few years, in Carter's presidency, OPEC still managed to keep prices high. So actually, in 1979, Jimmy Carter gave a speech, which became later known as the Malaise speech, even though he didn't actually say that word. And in this speech, he said, "America has a crisis of confidence that strikes at the very heart and soul of our national will." And while he was trying to, he sort of seemed like he was complaining, and this sort of backfired with the American people, and he lost some popularity. And over here you can see on this graph the inflation trend in the late 1970s, and during the 1970s, 6% is really high because we haven't seen 6% inflation since the 70s. In the foreign policy sphere, Carter was more successful for a time period anyway. He had a very idealistic foreign policy, sort of like you saw with Woodrow Wilson back in the era of World War I. And his foreign policy was dubbed human rights foreign policy. And so in September of 1978, he calls Egyptian Premier Anwar Sadat and Israeli Premier Menachem Begin to Camp David, or his retreat, and he starts to negotiate with them. And he tries to negotiate a peace treaty after all of the conflict that's been going on in the Middle East, with wars in 48, 56, 67, and 73. And so basically, after a few days of hard bargaining, when both the Israeli and the Egyptians threatened to leave, Carter's able to pull them together and get them to sign a peace treaty, a very historic peace treaty that are called the Camp David Accords. And basically, this does two things. One, it ends the ceasefire that had persisted after the end of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and so now there's definitely peace between the Israelis and the Egyptians. And in return, Israel returns the Sinai Peninsula, which they had taken over during the war, back to the Egyptians, and the Sinai is traditionally considered part of Egypt. And his idealistic foreign policy was also seen in the Panama Canal deal, where in 1979 he said that within 20 years the U.S. would return the Panama Canal to the nation of Panama, without requiring payment from Panama. And this backfired with conservatives, but it was touted around the world as a very good example of Carter's human rights policy. So there's Begin, Sadat, and Carter. And unfortunately, Carter's foreign policy success did not last. In 1979, there was an Islamic revolution against the autocratic and cruel Shah of Iran. And so what happens is Iran constitutes about 10% of global oil supplies at this time. So there's rising inflation as oil production is once again cut in the face of the revolution. So this hurts Carter domestically. Additionally, in October of 79, they allow the Shah to enter the U.S. for medical treatment, and this angers the Iranians who think that the Shah was evil. And so on November 4th, 1979, a mob storms the U.S. embassy in Tehran, and they take over 50 hostages. And in return, they want Carter and the U.S. to return the Shah to Iran so he can stand trial for his mistakes. And Carter refuses to surrender the Shah, and the Iranians basically then start to parade the blindfolded hostages before crowds and threaten to execute them. And this is all playing out on TV, and so Carter starts to lose popularity. And then Carter authorizes a secret rescue mission, which ends in a pretty humiliating failure when the rescue helicopters malfunction in the desert south of Tehran. And so the Iranians, the hostages in Iran remain hostages throughout the election of 1980. There's the blindfolded hostages. And in the election of 1980, Carter's pretty unpopular. His opinion, his public approval rating is actually around 25%. And so the Republicans nominate Ronald Reagan, who's a former actor, football player, and governor of California, for president. And during this campaign, he asks the American people one question: are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the majority of the people in America say no, thanks to stagflation and the embarrassment of the Iran hostage crisis. And Reagan and his vice presidential candidate, George Herbert Walker Bush, or George Bush the First, win a huge landslide victory, as you can see here. And this is considered the rise of the new right, which we'll be talking about in a different lecture.